Today in this lecture we would be looking at primarily the relationship between ecology and religion, and which I have titled as Religion, Nature and Environment. Now, for quite some time there has been a different understanding about ritual, if not religion, and within the discipline of anthropology, Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist, was the first to make sense of religion or the role of rituals in general. Now, even within anthropology, the works of Emile Durkheim is still seen to be the pioneer in that sense. But then this presentation or these lectures on the relations between religion, nature and environment will be slightly different, because I borrowed some of the works primarily on Roy Rapaport. In some of his works which I have partly mentioned in the context of human environment or cultural adaptations, of which I have often cited examples about his work on pigs for the ancestor, in which the sacrifices, slaughter of pigs were being carried out. Now, in this particular lecture, we would be looking at how and why there is the need and essence of this ritual, and what ritual actually is, and what is the embedded meanings to what ritual is. How is it different from the notion of layman's understanding of ritual? And apart from Roy Rapaport's work, I'll also keep on citing some of the works, the kind of concepts and theoretical understanding which are being provided by other sociologists and anthropologists. Now, in this particular lecture, Roy Rapaport in a way attempts to argue or bring out that religion in a way is central to the continuing evolution of life. Now, he tends to look at how human evolve over a period of time, and then in the process, so is their refining of religion in a way. Now, and in some way, the way he parted ways from other anthropologists and sociologists, and mostly Durkheim, is he tends to in a way bring in the rise of these modern sciences in relation to religion. So, in a way he attempts to distance himself from them by trying to more of follow a holistic approach, because earlier there was attempts to like differences or separate the ways like sacred and profane, and the kind of activities at the individual and the collective level is different. But Rapaport's work in a way opened up a new sort of aspect in terms of not just understanding the environment, but by injecting in this idea of ecology and its relationship with the human society, it opened up a new avatar altogether. Now, his book Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity, which in a way attempts to construe religious as well as about religion, which in a way insists that religion can and must be reconciled with science. So, in some way he attempts to bring religion, which often is being considered to be obsolete and irrational by many of the natural scientists or scientists in general, who are in a way trying to see it from a more objectivist and positivist perspective. Now, he tries to in a way refine what religion and religious life is. Now, he employ these methods of adaptive and cognitive approaches in his study of the humankind, and also by using these two approaches he come up with sort of a comprehensive analysis of religious how it evolved and the kind of significance by seeing it as a sort of coexistence with the invention of language and hence of culture as we know it. Now, when he talk about that evolution of life, he also talks about the differences between human and animal, and in what sense human is much more in a way a better positions to sort of engage in the modes of communications. And thus animals and plants necessarily not engage in this kind of transmission of or sort of modes of communication. These are some sort of questions which we are in a way trying to look at. And how does one make sense of rituals and the kind of meanings which are attributed and attached to it. Now, in some way he also attempts to brought together the kind of how religion happens to be the main component, and ritual in some way also constructs the kind of perceptions which we have around in our surrounding. Now, we tend to sort of take religion. Rapaport tries to situate religion, and by bringing out this explanation or notion of religion, he tends to situate religion in this, which is central in making of humankind's adaptations to their environment or surrounding. Now, what is so significant and important about religion? Can a society really exist without a religion or not? These are, for quite some time, has been some of the pertinent questions which are being engaged by many anthropologists and socialists in that sense. And Durkheim works, no doubt, is some of the classic examples. His work on the elementary forms of religious life, which he had extensively studied about the rudimentary forms of religion in the context of the Aboriginals in Australia. Now, I'll come to that in the later part. Now, if we try to bring in this anthropological evidence, which in a way allow to have or engage in a more comprehensive or holistic understanding of rituals as more of a practical matrix of religious life. Now, how do we in a way make sense of this stand? To construct of religion compatible with the scientific laws in a way is quite challenging when you have this sort of in our interactions or in our everyday life, we are being guided by this idea of more of an objectivist or a notion from the Western science. So, in which humanity in a way is ultimately responsible as that part of life on this planet, in which we are able to imagine and think. How does one situate, or how does one situate humanity in the context of this planet? When we talk about planet, we are also looking at other things around us, which are seen, unseen, which we can touch, which can remain untouched. So, in a sense, religion, if we talk in terms of the etymologically, in a way binds us to the external force. When we talk about external force, we are talking about those things which are unseen. it not only stabilizes our meaningful interaction with the world, but also provides a way out for our volatility. Now, therefore, why do we, in a way, sort of tries to negotiate and interact, if not make sense of the external forces? Because there are times where not just the human species, but other species, the way in which we tends to react or adapt when we overcome some kind or encounter some kind of anxiety or fear. So, that sort of, at that critical junctures, we tend to react and then find a way out to adapt ourselves to that situations. So, that kind of situations might be, the solution might be short term, it might be long term. So, depending on our needs and necessity, we tend to find a way out or a mechanism in order to adapt. So, that I will come to at a later part. Now, as I mentioned about Durkheim, what does Durkheim has to say about religion, and what is the kind of differences which we will try to look into in the context of the ideas which are being espoused and posited by Rapaport. Now, for Durkheim, religion in a way is sort of a way or a means to sort of a binding force between the known and the unknown. That is how one tries to build a bridge, if not find a way out in order to have an interact between these, the known and the unknown, and which is in a way conceived as a profane world of ordinary experience as sacred. Now, in which there is this extraordinary world which is primarily assumed to be located outside that experiences. Now, as an individual, we normally tends to negotiate, if not encounter in our everyday life, certain kind of work, certain kind of objects, and so many practices. But there are things which are beyond this, which normally or unconsciously we don't really look or tends to negotiate. And there is one reason why there is what Durkheim in a way tends to sort of draw a boundary between the gap which exists between the profane and the sacred. The sacred is something which remains unseen and which in a way is considered sometimes or interpreted as a myth or sort of a supernatural forces which is into play. Now, Durkheim, in his attempts to understand what religion is, he also recognized that we normally conceive of this what we call as sacred in terms of the spiritual powers, or more seen to be as a religion or as God. Now, what is ultimately unknown to us is our collective being in society. Now, for Durkheim, in a way, when he talk about the supernatural, or if not something beyond the individual thing, he tends to equate it with society, and his primarily focus is on the kind of solidarity which exists among the members in a society, and to him that sort of the society in a way governs and sort of directs an individuals to engage with his everyday life. Now, therefore, to him this particular existence of God or the religion what we talk about is created by the society. So, in a sense, religion is something which is being created by nothing but by society itself. Now, through this ritual to Durkheim, he tends to sort of posit an idea that we worship our unrealized power of this shared existence, society, and call it God. Now, therefore, for him, the society is sort of not just a binding force, but it is seen to be something which is outside the individual's understanding, and which is normally being presumed to be a religion, if not the existence of some spiritual powers which we normally address as God. Now, therefore, we sometimes tends to objectify the spirit world as nature and also worship that, and which in a way he has cited an example in the context of the Australian Aborigines, which is known as totemism. Now, in totemism, as I also discussed in some of the lectures, give an example wherein plants and animals are seen to be a totem object, and where an individual or society in a way attempts to objectify a particular plants or animals, which in a sense symbolizes the meanings or attempts to represent the society or maybe the individuals. So, in such practices of how one tends to like make sense of their environment by sort of representing themselves by the use of this totem, a cultural totem or so and so forth, where one society is being restricted of harming or even touching, if not engaging in a different action to that particular object, which is considered to be sacred, if not a reverence. Now, his work primarily, the classic work of Durkheim, the elementary forms of religious life, in a way attempts to demonstrate that science springs from the same desire to connect the known and the unknown that spawned religion. Now, Durkheim believed that the central task of rituals was to instill this collective representation in each of us, that is, in each and every individual. Now, in a state of this spiritual ecstasy, we tend to internalize relations which in a way bind us to each other in this social life. So, which he also talks about that bonding, that is the he in a way tends to sort of limit himself by discussing about the mechanical and the organic solidarity, by trying to look into the attempts of the division of labor which exists in the pre-industrial and the post-industrial society. Now, in a way, that sort of close interaction or bonding which exists among the collective representation, if not the individuals. Now, this is something which he has always tries to explain in his entire works. Now, in this, in relations with this particular ritual and religion, he also tends to look at how it sort of function as religion function as the bonding of the social life. But then he did not quite spell out the important conception of this in the context of a socialization process. Now, because what Durkheim does is the individual experience or the individual's action is sort of different from the collective, if not the social life, or maybe he doesn't really tries to look into the kind of how an individual stands to gain this access or ideas about religion or these rituals as a process of socialization. because many a times if you look at around the kind of rituals and ceremonies which normally one attends or once perform and functioned, we normally don't question. I am pretty sure that you hardly bothers even to ask questions of being part of any kind of ceremonies which are relating to your family, if not something which has a religious significance, because you tend engaging in doing that because that is part of the kind of socialization process and which ultimately becomes a tradition. Now, one does not really questions or find out what are the kind of innate meaning, or you don't tend to unquote what is being into that kind of practices. Therefore, what Rapaport in a way is different from Durkheim's understanding of religion is because Rapaport tends to look at sort of the evolution of human life, and in that he tries to inject not just ecology as such, but also the socialization process in which he is different from Durkheim's understanding of religion. Now, Rapaport in a way gives such kind of sort of an explicit explanation when he tries to talks about ritual, because he finds it in the ground when religion is made. Now, religion is not something which is independent of society or a collective life, but religion in a way is grounded, or the main foundation of religion is based on the society itself. Now, Rapaport also believes that one possible answer to the world's crisis would be sort of a religion founded on a postmodern science which is grounded in ecology. Now, in one sense, he tries to not just explain religion simply in relation to environment, but he tries to come up with a kind of insights or theory wherein he tries to address the kind of crisis which the world is witnessing. Because if you look around, there can be like numerous crises which are facing, but in this particular course we are normally talking about or emphasizing more on the ecological and environmental crisis. So perhaps now Rapaport in a way tends to bring in religion by in order to explain the kind of problems which we are facing, and it can be in a way an alternative way out. Now, what Rapaport has strongly talked about is rather than from the astronomical point of view, ecology in a way can find some kind of a solution, because human society in a way is conceived of as being inside rather than outside life on this planet. So, if we are to bring or find a solution rather than talking about something which is external or unknown to us, it is important to situate the things in the context that is the planet Earth which we are talking about. Therefore, it is the ecology which in a way is much more instrumental and appropriate in order to bring these solutions, rather than the experts which normally talks about something which is beyond the planet, that is the astronomy. You all know what the astronomy does. Now, in Rapaport's usage, humanity is in a way a personal quality, a collective noun, and more to do with a historical project. Now, by saying so, his definition of ritual in a way does not draw a hard line between the sacred and the everyday, between society and the individuals, or for that matters between culture and nature. So, this idea of the dualism of nature and culture, as we had discussed in the preceding classes, lectures, normally is because of the divisions, if not when one tends to look at nature and culture from more objectivist and Western science paradigm. So, this sort of epistemology in a way evolve, and personally I feel that Durkheim also in some way is still pretty much not coming out of that sort of notion of belief. Now, therefore, Rapaport is in a way trying to more of and encompass, if not a broader understanding of the relations between culture and nature, and not just as simply a dualism or a dichotomy, but there is certain traits which in a way has a connections. So, therefore, his attempt in a way is to sort of bridge the gap between the known and the unknown, as we had discussed. Now, how does he tries to explain or make sense of this, what he call as the evolution of human or humanity? Now, if you look at sort of the history, maybe not necessarily confined to human, but also even animals and plants. Usually, every mammals or species in a way engage in some kind of a transmission of, or to transmit information rather. And how does one communicate? Normally, we as a human feel that since the animals don't have language, they don't communicate. It is not that way and not the case. Rather, they also by using certain kinds of signs or different kinds of maybe sounds, they do engage in some kind of a transmission of informations. Now, normally we don't attempts to make sense of that, but human, apart from animals and plants, are superior or in a much more better position, because of we possess certain kinds of languages, and these languages also evolve, and then through our interaction with other cultural groups, we tend to in a way enrich a language. And language can be in the form of maybe using of these symbols, signs, so on and so forth, or maybe we can say the lexicons, or you all know what the lexicographer do. Now, and no doubt not every society has the culture of these written, and only few societies who are considered to be much more advanced and then civilized have this written form of languages. Others possess in a more of a very non-written and oral kind of information which is being passed on. Now, with the use of these what we call as symbolic transmissions, individuals in a way can learn from the account of others as well as from their own direct experiences. This symbol or symbolic transmission of information in a way is something you learn from observing others as well as from your individual experiences, and this learning in a way may be transformed in a more sort of recounting into the public domain, that is the public knowledge, which can in a way further recount to be preserved as a tradition. Now, therefore, depending on the cultural variation or from culture to culture, there are different symbols or symbolic expression which is normally looked into. Now, in some societies, even the concept on the kinds of greeting is different. Now, in some societies, rather than hugging or maybe shaking hands, it might be like slapping someone's face. So, that in a way is part of that cultural practices of being greeted in a more warmth and in a more cordial manner. Now, to explore these notions of understanding in this world is not simply to engage in to simply discover what is there, but the idea or the basic idea is to create what is present there. When we talk about create, we are not sort of bringing out something new, but we are trying to add some meanings to the already existing things which is there. Now, in some way, this is how we are in a way expanding our knowledge, or in a way our epistemology, so that by expansion of these our ideas of understanding of making sense of things, we tend to broaden our accounts, the way we perceive things, understanding, abstractions, evaluations, so on and so forth. Now, depending on the way we interact or the way we make sense of things around us, we engage in formulations of this sort of knowledge or understanding of things around us. Now, therefore, different human societies have different opinions, or maybe individuals have different perception or ideas about things around them. Now, for instance, in the earlier part of lecture, I also talk about the concrete science, wherein Levi-Strauss in a way tries to explain about the knowledge which the savage or the uncivilized peoples so-called have. How are they trying to make sense, or through the use of what particular ideas they are trying to make sense of their environment. Now, moving on, we as a human being in a way sort of attempts to engage in certain kinds of making sense of not just an environment, but also adapting different kinds of strategies in order to make sense of things around us, as we had explained, the abstraction, the understanding, evaluation, giving certain kinds of accounts, so on and so forth. Now, through these processes, in a way, these living systems or all sorts. When we talk about the living system, we are also talking about the organisms. It can be the human societies, and also the ecosystem, or even the biosphere, which in a way maintain themselves in the face of these perturbations. Now, what is these perturbations? It can be an instances of anxiety, fear, or so and so, wherein you are being compelled to react. You have to act in order to take hold of the situation. Now, in the face of these perturbations, continuously, in a way threatening them with disruption, death, or extinctions. So, how does one react or sort of cope with these situations is something which we would like to in a way look at. Now, adaptive responses in a way to this perturbation includes both a short term reversible changes of state, and also primarily a long term irreversible changes in structure. Now, for instance, if we look at the kind of say the deforestation, for example, maybe as a result of certain kind of development processes like building dams or roads and so on and so forth. Now, normally we happens to see uprooting of trees as something which is pretty much renewable, but in the process there are some long term effect wherein the habitat of that particular environment is being affected. Or for instance, the using of these chemicals and fertilizers in the context of through this scientific or technological advancement of agriculture has a long lasting impact on the soil. Now, which in a way is seen to be irreversible, or maybe we can say the non-renewable. So, this kind of actions which normally, or how do we react to any kind of situations, can have maybe a short term reversible and a long term irreversible changes in structure. Now, therefore, one needs to look at the kind of adaptation or adaptive mechanism of how human in a way tends to maximize its surroundings. Now, what then is change in the structure or irreversible change in structure? There can be this structural transformation in some subsistence, which in a way can make it possible to maintain more basic aspects of the system unchanged. These processes that in a way we can ask very fundamental questions about the evolutionary changes. What does this change in a way maintained unchanged? What does this change maintained unchanged? This is something which normally we talk about or often ask if we are to look at this evolutionary change in some sense, or maybe by allowing us to make sense of that the idea of this adaptation. Now, let me move on. Now, what is this idea of using the symbol, and what does symbol sort of replicate and make sense? Language in a way is considered to be the foundation of human way of life. Now, to a layman, if you ask what is language and how does one effectively communicate by using language, and or how does one communicate from someone who belongs to a different cultural group, and what could perhaps be the connecting or way of interactions. Now, in order to have an effective communication, it is important for someone that is the to encode the meaning which is being attached to a particular words or language. Now, unless I am able to make sense of the information which is being passed on, or the language is being able to encode by me, there won't be an effective communications between the provider and the receiver, the one who sends the message and the one who receives it. So, in order to make sense of that effective communications, the idea or language in a way is important. Therefore, language happens to be sort of the basic foundations of human way of life, the way we interact, the kind of cooperation which is normally being expected back from the other members of the society. Now, this language supposedly must have in a way emerged from through the process of this natural selection as part of the adaptive apparatus of the hominids. Normally, language is being something which is also chosen by observing our ancestors, or maybe which are normally handed down from our ancestors, that is, which is being passed on from the successive generations, which in a way is also a process of natural selection. Now, it has sort of accumulated over the past, and then through our experiences, the kind of knowledge or meanings which are embedded to it, and then how does it is made public or known to the other members of the group. So, that is how it expands and how it is evolved. Now, Leslie White in a way has a different meaning or explanation of symbols, what he meant by to be a language. Now, it's not simply an evolutionary novelty which also enhance the survival chances of particular species, but the most radical in a way innovation in the evolution or evolution itself since life first appeared. Therefore, this invention or development of language in a way is seen to be one of the most radical innovations of humankind. This is what Leslie White has to talk about in the context of what symbol is, and then how language has evolved over a period of time. Now, also humanity in a way is something different from other species which live and can only live in terms of meanings it itself must invent. Now, even the kind of evolution which takes place in a sort of making sense of things around us, we tend to engage and in inventing different kinds of language. Now, if you look at the English dictionary, many of the language which are contained in the English dictionary, many of the languages are more or less being borrowed from others like French, Latin, and so on and so forth. Now, and today if you look at English language in a way is supposedly one of the most rich. So, it in a way sort of evolve and then try to invent and Englishise that particular terms or concepts or maybe language from other culture group. Now, therefore, that it happens to be sort of a very complex and radical innovations of a particular culture group. And mind you, there are certain societies where the language are on the verge of extinction because of because of the kind of intervention from not just the in and around the society, but normally the culture group which use that particular language is not normally in a collective setting, rather it's scattered, and then through the process of this modernization and so processes, it tends to it becomes sort of endangered. So, like for example, the primitive tribal groups, and there are some societies which have these sort of problems which are being normally witnessed. Now, humanity in a way has to sort of encounter and negotiate in trying to understand, but by participating in its very sort of construction. Now, this is how symbol in a way is part of making sense of language, and it is only through this one's participation in its very construction that we are able to make sense of that particular language. Now, in a way, the kind of world, when we talk about the world, there can be a different world because of the cosmologies which we normally have. The world in which supposedly human lives are not comprehensively constituted by the movement of, say, rocks, that is the tectonics, meteorological, and also these organic processes. They are also not simply as we looked at or presume made up of these rocks, trees, oceans, but it is more or less being constructed out of this symbolically conceived and also performatively established cosmologies, institutions, rules, and values. Now, by saying so, we are not belittling the existence of others' constituents or processes. But apart from that, it is also important to look at how these sort of elements are being processes or it is being created. Now, for instance, the kind of institution which we are, maybe the society which we are into, and the ethos and values which guided us, again is important, and which in a way is symbolic to a particular society. Now, for instance, me in a society or in a family playing the role of a father is also important for the sort of how we perform or make sense or acted out in the society, and also the way we perceive our surroundings, that is reverence to the kind of the objects which are around us. How do we sort of employ that particular metaphors of how making sense of things around us, the plants and animals, so on and so forth. Now, human worlds in this context are therefore in a way inconceivably richer than the worlds inhabited by other creatures. No doubt, through the use of certain kind of meanings which are being attached, we are not saying here the human world is superior in nature, but it is much more complex than which we ever thought, because even seeing a particular individual in the society is so much complex that it is difficult for someone to interpret one's perception or thinking by merely observing on someone's action or a particular behavior. So, therefore, the human world or the human society is seen to be one of the most complex species of creatures. Now, each human society in a way develop a unique culture. Now, what is this culture? Because it is unique because it constitutes such constructs that which normally includes not only a spatial understanding of the surrounding, but other things unseen because which are unknown, as real as those trees and animals, and also the rocks which are normally being visible and which can be touched. Now, why is it that something which is unseen so much playing an important role? Because every culture or every society attributes certain kind of meanings to a certain kind of objects, if not something which is unseen. Now, therefore, it is where the idea of this religion and rituals happens to be like playing an important role in this. Now, what is this ritual form? Ritual, according to Rapaport, in a way sort of denote the performance, that is an action of more or less an invariant sequences of formal acts and utterances not entirely encoded by the performance. Why is it that it is not encoded by the performers but by others? Because the performer simply does what is being practiced from the past, right? Therefore, he merely act, and it is this act usually are repetitive in nature. Now, if you talk about ritual, the ritual has certain different meanings, and it also encompasses much more than the kind of religious behavior which we are looking in this particular lecture, because there are also different practitioners and discipline which talks about ritual. Now, for instance, the psychiatrists in a way use this particular word ritual similarly, which is conceived to be rather related, synonymized with ceremony, to refer both to pathological stereotype behaviors of some neurotics, which is borrowed from the study made by Sigmund Freud way back in 1907, and also to a certain conventional and repetitive but nevertheless adaptive interaction between people. Also, in the discipline of sociology and anthropology, ritual and ceremony in a way designate a large range of social events, not all of which are to be categorized as religious or may denote the formal aspects of such events. Now, also the ethnologists, like who are more or less into the study of culture, language, have used it virtually as interchangeably with display, that is how it is being performed and acted out, to also designate the behavior they have in a way observed not only among other mammals, but also other among reptiles, birds, fish, and even members of the other phyla. Now, therefore, ritual is not something which is being normally restricted to human as such, but also other mammals which are normally being displayed. Therefore, rituals has in a way a different embedded, if not encompasses not just religious behavior, but sort of the species daily encounters or daily display of the actions. Now, in a way, rituals designates a form of structure, what Rapaport in a way has talked about, and Tambia has a different understanding here. Ritual is often taken to be a symbolic form. Now, because unless it has certain kind of meanings attached to that particular performances, ritual is meaningless. Therefore, it has to be understood as a symbolic form. Now, the significance of this observation that our definition of ritual is formal, the performances of more or less invariant sequence of formal acts and utterances, not entirely in a way encoded by the performance, logically entails the establishment of conventions, the sealing of social contract, and the construction of these integrated conventional orders. So, in a way, you are following a particular rules and principles by engaging in these rituals. Now, therefore, it becomes sort of a symbolic form. Now, for instance, if you look at the Murring ritual cycles, which also constitute a functional ecological theory of ritual in general, where I quote from Rapaport when he talks about the slaughter of pigs for the ancestors, or the sacrifices of dead pigs to the ancestor, that if we are to in a way understand what is uniquely human, we must also consider those aspects of existence which man shares with other creatures. So, it is important for us to establish the kind of meanings we share with other creatures. So, in a way you can just go through this particular slide, where in the sacrifices of pigs is important, and it symbolizes not just the needs of the people who engage in slaughtering, but also in a way it is a practices which is perceived to be an adjustment to their environment. Now, sometimes it can be in a way observed in two different aspects, which is more of adaptive, and it can also be maladaptive. And it can, as we also discussed in the preceding lectures about the slaughtering of pigs among the Sembaga community, that is the Mering, we also questions about what is the manifest and the latent functions of this particular rituals of slaughtering of pigs. Now, therefore, this particular religious rituals in a way is to be understood in the context of the beliefs which is associated with them in that particular frame of reference. Now, if we try to see it from something which is external to it, it might not make sense. Therefore, any kind of act or performed or a formal act has to be sort of understood in that frame of reference. Now, otherwise, there are different other explanations about ritual again, because myth in a way also implies ritual, and ritual implies myth, and they are seen to be one and the same. And ritual also signifies neither more or less than what is signified by the references symbolically encoded in its action and utterances. This is by Edmund Leach. Now, the ritual form in a way adds something to the substance of the ritual, that is symbolically, which is encoded substance by itself, cannot be usually expressed. In essence, Rapaport takes the ritual to be the social act which is basic to humanity, that is a part of the socialization processes. Now, encoding by other than performer is important, because the performers of ritual do not specify all the acts and utterances consisting their own performances. They follow more or less orders established or taken to have been established by others. Now, why is it that the performance or the performer usually don't engage in specifying all the acts and the utterances which normally is constituted in the one's performances, because usually these meanings which are being attributed or attached to it are more or less already established or taken to have been established by others. So, one in a way tends to not really imitate, but meanings which are also already encoded in the previous performances. Therefore, this kind of behavior in ritual tends to be more of punctilious and repetitive, and rituals are performed in the specified context, that is, they are regularly repeated at times established by clock, calendar, the biological rhythm, or we can also talk about certain agricultural rituals which are normally practiced by different native societies in different physical and environmental conditions, which again is also defined by certain social circumstances and other, and often they tends to account in special places as well. Now, what is true of human is also true of other animals. Now, the kind of rituals in some way it might be explicitly different or have different meanings, but it also is pretty much true in the context of other animals as well. Now, what is rituals and ceremonies? The differences, because normally we tend to see rituals and ceremonies as one and the same. Now, in the works of Gluckman and Gluckman, they state that the term ritual is more stipulated to cover actions which had reference in the view of the actors, that is, such as to occult powers, where such beliefs were not present. It was suggested that the use of ceremony would be much more appropriate. Now, Ferd in a way has sort of a different opinion here, and which I quote, ceremonial I regard as a species of ritual in which, however, the emphasis is more upon symbolic acknowledgement and demonstration of a social situation, upon the efficacy of the procedures in modifying that situation, whereas other ritual procedures are believed to have a validity of their own. Ceremonial procedures, while former in character, are not believed in themselves to sustain situation or effect a change in it. So, this is the kind of differences which Ferd has posited between this ritual and ceremony. And in the context of theater and ritual, if you look at the differences, in a way, when the ritual is being performed, those who are present in a way becomes part of the congregation, and sort of defining relations of the members of this congregation to the event for which they are present is more or less participation. Now, whoever is part of that ritual in a way not just become a congregation, but also become a participant or a participant observer. And then, whereas in the case of theater or theatrical event, normally it is the performers, and on the one hand it is the audience or the spectator. That is what is being the performer and the audience. Now, audience and the performer are more or less radically separated from each other, always in function, almost always in space and time, and often clearly marked off by the race stages. Even the stages is different, and so on and so forth, because it is pretty much different. Now, Gluckman in a way has used the term called ritualization to refer to the kind of assignment of ritual roles to individuals in conformity to their secular relations and status, that is the kinship relations. How an individual acted out or how one performs a ritual is also more or less based on one's social or secular relations and statuses of someone playing the role of a father, and then so on and so forth. Therefore, that sort of differences is important for us, that is to clear off the differences between ritual and ceremonies and theater and ritual. Now, how does ritual becomes a mode of communication? Now, these ritual utterances are not merely words, but which are frequently known to be which possesses special characteristic or stereotype, weirdness, which Malinowski again talk about, and repetitiveness that may enhance their seeming force, and so may the often noted emphasis upon propriety and precision in uttering them. So, this separation in time and space of some rituals from their daily life, the kind of ritual poses and gestures, the weirdness of some of these ritual utterances, what once exuberant elaboration of some objects and structure used in rituals becomes clear. This particular effectiveness of the signals in a way is also an enactment, and hence if they are easy to sort of distinguish from the ordinary technical acts, that is the transmitters of this rituals message also are among their most important receivers. Now, I'll stop here and then continue the different enactments of how meanings are being attached to rituals in the next lectures. Thank you.